the cloud the last time. Okay, so we are recording. All right. Well, thank you everyone for coming to Dublin Data Science and the virtual form that it's been taken, unfortunately, due to COVID. Thank you everyone for kind of foregoing your Zoom fatigue to attend this tonight. So unlike lately, we've been doing a lot of workshops, but I'm delighted to say I get to take a back seat tonight because Lucia Cabrera has very kindly offered to give us a talk on her NLP work. I won't steal her thunder by explaining what she's going to talk about, but I've always thought this project was fascinating, and you know, it's a lot of interesting stuff that can be done. I'm just going to ask people to just stay on mute while Lucia is talking. Like at the end, it gets a bit more free form. But if you do have any questions or anything like that, what we tend to do here is, because of the virtual format, if you just put your questions into chat, I can kind of relate to her the questions because she won't see them because of the full screen. And basically, so I'm effectively for the next, 40 minutes, 50 minutes, for however the main part of the talk. Once kind of we're done and it gets a bit more free form, feel free to unmute. But it's generally just easier, unless specifically requested, for everyone to just stay on mute. And if people are joining, I'll probably mute them as they come in if they're not muting themselves. But anyway, enough talking about me. We will hand over to Lucia, and like I said, you'll probably be hearing from me during the talk, and yeah, I'll do some wrap up towards the end. But other than that, it's over to Lucia.
All right, thanks, Vic. So yes, hi everyone. I can't see anyone, so it's a bit weird just talking to myself. So I'm Lucia, and I'm going to be telling you about. So I just finished my PhD. I submitted there in September. So I'm going to be talking about basically what I did for my thesis. Not all of it, just to give you some kind of main points. So my work was on politeness, and I tried to use NLP tools to kind of analyze it to some extent. So I'll be telling you about that. And yes, I'll get going. So basically what I'll be covering today will be just what is understood by politeness in more linguistic terms from linguistic theory. Then the data that I used and why I chose that data, because I used romantic comedy scripts. So I'll fill you in a bit more on what I did in a minute. Then how I parsed those scripts, the film scripts, how I created the parsers, then the politeness package that I used, and then the uses of kind of, how can NLP tools kind of help, and what I did and what possibilities would be out there. So just before we start, like my main question was, I wanted to find out whether there were differences between men and women in terms of the use of politeness, and romantic comedies in particular, which was the type of film that I chose. So I'll explain why I chose that and the reason behind it. So that was kind of...
Lucia, were you investigating gender bias in Hollywood?
A little bit, yes.
I am shocked. I mean,
I know, madness. No one's ever done it before.
Yeah. Well, just I mean, I'm shocked you'd think that. I mean, it's a bastion of liberalism, and
we're all equals in Hollywood. Yeah. So yeah, that was kind of why I kind of wanted to do that, and I thought there'll be some interesting findings there. So yeah, so let's get started with what is understood by politeness. So there are loads of scholars who have done and given different definitions of politeness, but one that I kind of like, it's by Watts. So there's two definitions, two different types of politeness that he talks about. So first order politeness, which is kind of what is understood by, people in general, right? The behavior that we understand as being polite and a certain culture. So obviously that will vary from culture to culture, but it's kind of what is, your please and thank yous, what we first think of politeness. And then on the other hand, he has second order politeness, which would be a more theoretical construct. So within a theory of behavior and language use, there's again a bit more theoretical. Now, so the thing is with politeness is that many scholars think that it's highly dependent, not that they think, I may agree, it depends a lot on context. And it's true that it doesn't mean that a linguistic form will not automatically mean that a sentence or something is polite. But it can't be denied that, the use of please and thank yous is kind of associated with politeness. And that certain structures usually are interpreted as polite or impolite. So that is my stance, that I understand that context is extremely, politeness is something that can be very sensitive to context. But there is still, there are some linguistic features that help us because of, so often they co-occur with politeness strategies or polite, behavior, that they're kind of become kind of formulaic in a way. So that is my stance. Now,
just ask Lucy, when you say like first order and second order,
that's just the name he decided to give. So some people say politeness 1, politeness 2. Okay. It's not that one is better or worse or in any case. It's just that if you're doing a linguistic study, let's say from a linguistic background, as I said, sometimes we think, okay, please, it will always be polite, but in theory of politeness, that might not necessarily be the case. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, yeah. I mean, I remember, you can be polite without being really polite, if you know what I mean.
Exactly.
When you weaponize it, you know what I mean, where you're using it to be very, very aggressive or offensive or whatever.
Exactly.
You're technically adhering to the norms of politeness. It's all please, thank you, sir, blah, blah, blah.
But might not be actually polite. Yeah. So I'm sure there are people who have just studied politeness that would be not very happy with my approach to politeness study, because there's this one particular author, Sarah Mills. She is like, well, everything depends on who you're talking to and the context and how they interpret it. So she thinks a lot about how the other person interprets it, and not so much what I'm saying. So how the other person receives that message, which is all, it's grand. I understand that. But if you want to do a study on politeness, you have to have some sort of framework that we all understand to be what is politeness, if that makes sense. So yeah, that would be one thing.
Yeah. Plus, trying to figure out how it's been received is, it's another hard. Challenge. Yeah.
It's like, they might be all smiles, but then they don't think you're being polite. So, which I agree that sometimes you might be saying something and the other person doesn't interpret it as polite. But if you want to do an analysis of politeness, you have to have some sort of framework that you can go off from.
And sorry, just to say to everyone, like I said, I'm jumping in and asking questions, but if anyone else has any questions, just pop them in the chat. I'm monitoring it. I have a second screen here, so I can see the chat live. So, I'll try and ask the questions as appropriately close to them being asked as I can.
Moving on to another very important concept from a theoretical linguistic point of view, let's say, is the concept of face. So this was the face is what we all understand, but losing face or saving face. Brown and Levinson, actually, their work on politeness was quite influential. They had a lot of criticism, but it can't be denied that they were very influential in the field, particularly because they provided like a kind of clear handbook, let's say, of politeness strategies and what you can do in certain cases. So, but what they understand is that in any interaction, the important thing is to attend the other person's face, either their positive face or negative face. So making sure that the hearer or the listener, whichever you want to call it, they're not losing face, or that you as a speaker are also saving face in that case. So within that concept, they have the notion of positive face, so the need for any speaker to be accepted and appreciated by others. So the need to kind of compliments or things like that. And negative face, so the right for a speaker to be or a listener to be free from imposition. So this will make sense in a minute, because depending on the type of face that you're trying to maintain or enhance will depend on the type of strategy that you use in an interaction. Yeah. So based on those concepts, you have positive politeness strategies and negative politeness strategies. So usually positive politeness strategies, you're using them to attend to the listener's positive face, right? So these kind of strategies here will be like super strategies. That's not their terminology. That's the way I kind of see it. It's like big picture. So basically, it would be one of them is claim common ground. So, for example, complimenting the other person, or showing that you belong in the same group, kind of nicknames, or joking with the other person to show that there's something in common between the two speakers, to make them feel that they're valued in a way. This is kind of big picture stuff I'm talking about. Then another one would be to convey that the speaker and the hearer are cooperators. So the speaker would have to show that the interest of the hearer are also the interest of the speaker in a way, to make them to say, or to show that if something were to happen to the hearer, it would also affect the speaker, if that makes sense. And then another one would be to fulfill the hearer's want for some X. So what they mean by this is, like, if the hearer needs something done, a favor, they said like giving gifts, right, as an example. But that would be like an action, right? But if the hearer needs something done, or whatever it might be, the speaker can attend to that. So that would be all related to positive face, to attending to the positive face needs, right? And then you have negative politeness strategies, which I should have mentioned something before, sorry. Also what they say, what Brannon Levinson say as well, is that in any kind of interaction, when you talk to a person, you are risking committing a face-threatening act. So an FTA, I don't know if you can see that there. So basically you are risking offending the listener, or in any way, right? Attacking their face in some way. So what you want to do is to try to use certain strategies to mitigate that, or to avoid that, right? So with negative politeness, remember that negative face was that the listener or the hearer did not want to be imposed on. So a very common face-threatening act for negative face would be requests, right? So if I'm asking someone a favor, I might be imposing on them. So here the speaker has two options. Oh, sorry.
Or presume it could also be something like swearing in someone's presence.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Because you're imposing on their ability on their desire to not be swear upon.
Yeah, exactly. Or
okay.
Exactly.
Or not to hear bad language.
Exactly. In that case.
Okay.
Yeah, does that make sense? So this part is just that I've read it a lot, so sometimes I kind of assume that it makes sense, but if it doesn't, do ask questions, please. So here the speaker has two options really. So they can be direct, just commit the face-threatening act. So a good example would be, think about, I don't know, a surgeon in an OR. If they need something, they're not going to try to be polite and, oh, could you please pass me the scalpel, right? They're going to be direct and commit the face-threatening act. And it's unlikely that that utterance will be seen as impolite or rude, right? So that's one option. And then the other option would be to do the face-threatening act with redress. So do something to mitigate the fact that you are doing something that might impose on the hearer, right? So actually, there's been studies done on kind of, in Ireland, negative politeness would be quite common, because what you do is, one of the examples would be pessimistic. So imagine you go into a shop and you say something like, oh, you wouldn't happen to have this, rather than saying, do you have X? Do you see what I mean?
Yeah.
So you're pessimistic from the beginning. Or we'll see some other strategies as well, or some markers. For example, hedging. Perhaps it would be possible to do this. So perhaps it would be a hedge, right? Yeah. Apologies, when it's like, I'm sorry to bother you, or gratitude, right? So there's different strategies that once you're asking for something, and well, I'm giving an example of a request because I think it's the clearest way to see it.
I have heard that, I'm trying to remember where, but I do know someone, there was a conversation about how maybe you noticed it, but one of the things they noticed about Ireland was how apologetic people were when they were going into like restaurants or shops, or they're almost apologizing to ask, even though that's the main reason for, like, I'm selling coffee, you want to buy coffee, but you're apologizing to me because you're imposing upon me for me handing you my business.
Exactly.
Like you're giving me money, I'm giving you coffee, that's why we're both here, but you're apologizing for it.
For bothering or potentially offending you in any way. Exactly. So that would be very common. Like, Or if you ask, like, I don't know, if you go into a shop and you want to ask, it's like, oh, I'm sorry to bother you. It's like, that's technically it's the person's job to look after you, help you, but you always like, I'm sorry, that kind of way. So yeah, that would be one of the strategies. Now, obviously, depending on the type of utterance, or again, a request, the higher the risk of offending the person, the more markers that you will use to mitigate that. So if you're asking someone for, I don't know, a pen, you're not going to say, like, I'm terribly sorry to bother you, but would you mind, but if you're asking someone, I don't know, for money, perhaps you might use some strategies to mitigate that. Yeah. So far, we're good.
I'm following. If anyone else has any questions, like I said, I'm keeping an eye in the chat.
Cool.
So, following it so far.
Great. So
what is this? Is it, sorry, just to ask, what field is this? Is this essentially what the kind of thing you do in linguistics?
Yeah, it would be sociolinguistics, right? Because you're kind of looking at kind of behavior depending on culture. So again, this is very sensitive to culture as well, right? And context and who the participants in the conversation are. So there's a lot of factors that depend on, how something is seen. If the power relations between the two the interlocutors, right? If you're talking to your boss, it's not the same as talking to your brother or sister. So all those things are kind of taken into account when, obviously, we don't do it consciously. We're not thinking, okay, he's has power over me, so I'm going to be more polite. But like, it kind of comes naturally that you're aware of the context and where you're speaking or who you're speaking to. Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
So yeah, and then just some politeness markers. So kind of those type of linguistic choices that you might, recognize that when we're just help us sound or be perceived as more polite. So intensifiers will be one marker, also known as boosters. I prefer the word intensifiers. So this would be common, for example, when you're giving compliments to someone. So you're attending to their positive face, right? It's like, oh, that is so nice, that is so lovely, etc. Right? Then hedges, that would be quite common with requests, like I feel, I believe. Also, sometimes when even if you're certain of something, right? Like if you're an expert in the field, but someone asks you a question, even if you know the answer is right, sometimes if you don't want to sound too forward, you might say, well, I think it might be this. So that's another way of hedging. Apologies as well, gratitude, modality. So, but modality, I mean like modal verbs like would, could, can, or will, like would you mind, could you do this instead of can you, which is not a huge difference, but sometimes when you use past modals like would or could, the ones that I have here, it might be seen as more polite, a little bit anyways. Then we have on the other side, which would be perhaps on the side of impoliteness or rudeness, you have commands, such as giving orders, basically, which in some cases, and again, in some contexts, is perfectly acceptable and it's not going to be seen as rude. But if I'm asking for a stranger for something, then you might want to avoid direct commands. And then swearing could also be seen as impoliteness. Again, I think we talked about, you and I were talking about this. It depends a lot on context, right? Who you're talking to. Are you talking to your friends? I think something that came up was like the C word. I'm not going to say it, but perhaps in a group of lads, that might come up a lot. But if someone says it to me, I might feel offended. So, but that doesn't mean that swear words have certain, they're highly, how do I put this? They're found frequently in impolite contexts. Yeah. So those are some markers.
Yeah.
So it's kind of like, again, this is a very broad, very brief explanation of politeness in general, but just to give you an idea of what I understand or what is understood by politeness, that it goes beyond saying, your pleases and thank yous.
So is swearing there because it's not so much a marker of politeness, it's more about its presence means it's impolite.
Exactly. Or it could,
right.
In many contexts, it will lead to, the utterance being interpreted as impolite.
Right.
Right.
Okay.
So within politeness, there's also some people who study impoliteness in particular, but they use the concept of politeness as, the like an umbrella term, right?
Sure. Yeah.
So far, because I think I'm going to move on to my data now. So, why is that not working? There you go. So yes, as I mentioned very briefly, like the data that I used was romantic comedies. The reason that I want, first of all, I like romantic comedies and I'm not ashamed to admit it. Doesn't matter. There are some really bad romantic comedies, but there are some really good ones. And I think that happens with every genre. So, but I think romantic comedies have a really bad rap, and I'm trying to show that they're not all that bad. But the reason I wanted to look at romantic comedies was, first of all, when I first started looking to language and gender, which was what I was interested in, there's loads of research in the way that the differences between men and women, how they communicate. There's loads that's been done there, political speeches, whatever it might be. But with in film studies with romantic or films in general, there have been loads of studies on differences between men and women, but it's mainly between like the roles that they play and their actions, and rather than the language that they use. So actually the whole thing started with, I don't know if you're familiar with the Bechdel test, which
The
is
script thing.
Yeah, so basically it's like when you look at a film, it's like, is there any conversation between two women that are not talking about men? So if you pass that test, then you pass the Bechdel test. So it kind of started there because I was curious about that, and then I started thinking of like what genre, they have, romantic comedies, they have this traditional role of like, men have their very, they're the player, or the woman always wants to get married, and they're very stereotypical in the way they portray men and women, or they used to be. I'm sure the genre has evolved, absolutely, but at the same time
there is a certain formula.
Exactly. So that was also another thing. There are certain key scenes that are always present in the romantic comedy, like, they meet cute and then they have a fight, but then they get back together, and then they have a bigger fight, and then they split up, but then they realize they are meant to be together and they get back together. So there's something else that I did that I'm not really going to go into today. It was like a qualitative analysis of 3 films. So that was useful to look at those 3 films, and I had the same key scenes. So I was able to compare them because the same thing was kind of expected in those 3 scenes. Then also is a genre which attempts to be similar to natural language, right? I'm not saying it's the same as natural language. I know it's scripted, and I know there's many other factors that go into creating a script, but a good script should try to be as close to natural language, to real language as possible. And that in a way reflects the way that the roles of gender in society kind of, whenever the film was written, to an extent. Again, I know there are edits and there are producers and there are many other factors, but it's not like I'm looking at Marvel films, which would be, the language would be probably quite different to normal day-to-day interactions. So what I understand by romantic comedies is like what the main thing about the film is like the quest for love, or just trying to find love, and usually it's like in a funny way, and almost always has like a happy ending, a successful conclusion. It's not always the case. Like Annie Hall would be a good example where they don't end up together. I'm sorry if someone hasn't seen Annie Hall, I just spoiled it. But the idea is that, the main thing, the main part of the plot is love between the 2 main characters, or and sometimes, like Love Actually, that kind of thing, between different characters or so on. So,
well, they're also the other thing that struck me when you first told me about all of this was just the cultural impact that romantic comedies have. Like they not only mirror culture, but they also, to a certain extent, it's a two-way street.
Yeah.
So that in terms, it does become reinforcing.
Exactly. I think there's something with a study with Sex and the City, that things that were used in the show starting to pop up in kind of real life. So it
Yeah.
does in a way affect the way we speak, right? So
Yeah.
I found that interesting. Yeah, so I had 56 scripts in total. So they're all in English. They're mainly American or from the UK. So that's another thing, important thing. This is all for English speaking kind of films. With other languages, other things should be taken into consideration. I know it doesn't seem like an awful lot of scripts, but it was just my good old self. So, and I had to tidy them up. So that's as much as I could manage. And then,
on that, I mean, I mean, I know obviously you can probably only really talk to Spanish, but is the romantic comedy a genre in other languages as well? Like, obviously you've got Bollywood, but they're kind of their own thing. But like, would you get Spanish-speaking films that are effectively formulaic romantic comedies, or do they tend to be different?
I can only think of Uruguay, right? Which is, by the way, that's
Sure.
where I'm from for everybody else. I can't think of any examples right now, to be honest.
Okay.
But it might be the case. I don't know. Maybe Spain. Maybe they have more. You know.
Oh, apparently they get them in France.
There you go.
Thank you. Thank you.
Oh, actually, yeah, France.
Thank you, chat.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
the French. Okay, so there's like French, and sorry, just to ask the chat then, would they follow kind of your stereotypical Hollywood narrative kind of arc in terms of, and assuming that you've seen both? I mean, because obviously these kind of films are going to a certain extent hold a mirror up to culture too, and I mean, to a certain extent, America does export its culture, so you know, America will have an influence on all of cinema, regardless of the planet. But it is such an iconic genre. Like, I mean, if you're going to come up with, you know, film genres in, you know, like, what's the name of that? You know, the quiz show where you a survey of 100 people. Romantic comedy is probably going to be the top answer. It's Family Feud in America. It's Family Fortunes here. Yeah, but I mean, I would say if you say like name a movie genre, I would imagine romantic comedy would have to be if it's not the top answer, it's the second top answer.
Yeah, probably. I can't, to be honest, I can't. But again, in Europe, we don't have that many films. We don't get that many films made in general. Actually, thinking of Argentina, like they might have a few, but I don't. Yeah, might be quite popular. I don't know. I'm not
sure.
I don't want to take a wild guess, but it could.
According to the chat, it's a bit of both. Like it's kind of, it's got it's a mix of kind of the US and probably with a French slant. Very good.
Cool. And then as well, so they go from the late 70s to the late 2010s. So obviously the 90s and the 2000s, there was like a boom of romantic comedies. This was like, it had like its heyday. And also so availability, that I managed to get scripts, right? So what I did, I kind of compiled a list. I went onto Rotten Tomatoes and IMDb and kind of top 100, you know, romantic comedies of all time type of thing. Was having a look, and the ones that I didn't know very well, I looked into the plot, whether I thought that would qualify as a romantic comedy. And I had a list of about nearly 200 films. And out of those 200, I could only get scripts for about 56. Now, these are the websites that I used, but I also should mention that there are other websites, but you have to pay. And couldn't really afford to pay about €10 a script for about 50 films. So if anyone
€10 a script, really?
Some of them were more expensive than that. Yeah. So I was like, no, thank you. So I just used the ones that that were just there and
that you could get for free.
Exactly.
Excellent.
So that the thing as well that I had, like say from the 70s, I might have had maybe 3 or 4, whereas in the 90s and the 2000s, I had about 20 for each decade kind of thing. So
is there any reason why like there was such a boom in the 90s and 2000s? Has that did you ever come up with an answer to that, or did
not quite? Like I think what happened, like they so there was like in, you know, the Hays Code, like in Hollywood there was like a code that there was
from
kind
the
of
40s, wasn't it?
Yeah, exactly. And then when that kind of stopped, they went on to they all went a bit mad with, like, you know, sex and being quite open about what they showed. And then it seems like it's circled back to like a bit more of a traditional roles. So like say in like Woody Allen films and stuff like that, they were very open about homosexuality or having threesomes or things like that. And then after that, for some reason, it's like it circled back to a more traditional way of looking at films.
I know like the 70s in Hollywood, now this isn't romantic comedies, but the 70s I do know was kind of considered the high watermark for Hollywood as artistic content, content. But basically what happened is they put like all the directors and script writers and artists in charge. Like United Artists came from that, Francis Ford Coppola and all them. Unfortunately, they all went mental and almost bankrupted themselves, which allowed the executives to reassert control in the 80s, which is why things got a lot more formulaic in the 80s. There's been a bunch of, there's a really good book about all that, Raging Bull, Easy Rider, Raging Bulls or something like that. And it's all about that. So probably romantic comedy being such a large genre, it probably got subsumed into that larger phenomenon.
Yeah. And like it was almost guaranteed to, you know, make you money, you know, if you had the right leading female role, and you know, that kind of, perhaps that was part of it, but I'm not.
Yeah, but I mean, your bankable cinema stars and stuff, which apparently doesn't exist anymore. It's like one of the big problems Hollywood have now, that is that, you know, the starring roles don't guarantee box office return anymore.
Right, I didn't know that.
Yeah,
I suppose with Netflix and stuff, but so it's not like uniform in terms of like how many films I have per decade. So that was something to kind of take into consideration for something that I'll talk about a bit later on. So yeah, once I had all my data, I had to kind of tidy it up. And before I get into this, I have to just acknowledge that Nick was a huge help here, like a massive help. Bear in mind, I didn't know how to open an R file when I started doing this. So I had all my scripts and I was happy out, and I didn't know what to do with them. I didn't know how to get the information. I was like, I'm just going to do NLP, and I didn't have a clue. So I panicked and I messaged Fran. So thank you, Fran, if you're there. And I asked for a bit of help from Mick, and he was so patient. But I'll say as well, he honestly taught me so much. I'm not trying to suck up to him or anything like that. But he did say, it's like, it's going to take you a while. And I was like, I'll be grand. And then it did take me a while. And everything he kind of predicted, it kind of happened. It's like, you're going to get stuck here. And it's like, no, be grand. But then I did get stuck wherever he said I would get stuck. But going back to the parsers.
I only knew that because I got stuck there too. So I knew, I walked that road, so I knew where the potholes were.
And he knew, like when he was explaining it, he was kind of helping me with some of the, you know, the parsers. Like, he was like, you're not getting it now, but you will eventually. And I was like, I got it. I know what he's talking about. And then when I had to do it myself, I was like, yeah, no, I don't have a clue what I'm doing. But eventually I did. And whenever something worked, it was a great feeling. And there was actually one day that I wrote a bit of code and Nick saw it and was like, oh, it's actually very smart. I might use it. So that was a great day for the parish. Very happy that day. But that's a side note. But yeah, so basically the main information I wanted to get from the scripts was I needed the character's name. I just wanted to get the character's name, the gender of the character, and just the line of dialogue. And then as I went on, like thinking about what my question was and other stuff, I just want to add the listener's name, the listener's gender, the screenwriter gender, and the word count as well. So the word count was quite important because if I want to compare between men and women, male characters have considerably more lines of dialogue than women. So it was important to know, like it was important to work with proportions rather than just counts. So if I had the word count, I would be able to create a proportion. And then as well, just while we were there, it was like, okay, I'll just add the gender of the director and the year the film was made in, but eventually didn't end up using that, but I just did that anyways. So I'm just gonna show a few kind of what I was looking at when I created the parsers, when the parsers were developed. So this will be the most common format, which you probably all recognize if you know, from looking at film scripts. So you have your directions here, right? The name of the character, and then the line of dialogue. So what we noticed was that sometimes for the name of the character started after 3 tabs, and the line of dialogue started after 1 tab. So we just extract, if it was anything that was after 3 tabs, that was extracted as the name of the character. if then what was extracted, sorry, after one tab, that was line of dialogue, and anything else would have been directions, right? Now, this is quite a very common format, but sometimes I did have to check each script manually though, because sometimes there was 3 tabs, sometimes there was 4, sometimes there was 2. It did change back and forth. And then another thing that I checked as well, once I had the output, there were some random cases, maybe there was like a number somewhere randomly in the script or something that I hadn't planned. So I had to just double check, but I just want to have it as tidy as possible, just because I, again, make Bridget said this is going to make your life easier later on, and it did. So it did take me a while, but I think I'm glad I did that. So especially because I did feel towards the end I was like very comfortable doing this. So I would check that, yeah, 3 tabs or whatever it might be. So that was one format. Then another format was, instead of tabs, it would be spaces. This took me a while to figure out that it was spaces, because you can see this in R Studio, but not when you get the TXT file. So when I realized it was spaces, I kind of changed it. And same thing, you had to, for each script, I would check how many spaces were there before the name of the character, how many spaces were before the line of dialogue. And in this case, you also had spaces before the directions. So you also had to include that. And sometimes this one was a bit annoying, just because sometimes it was like, instead of 10, it would be 9 just for one case. So you had to, each time you ran it, I had to check the output. So it's a bit tedious at times, but it was nice when it worked, if that makes sense.
How many different formats did you have to deal with?
I have about 4 overall.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so it wasn't too bad. But the thing was that even if it was 4, you still had to check every one of them. Again, if you want to do it, for yourself, just like to see what what's out there, it wouldn't be that important. I wouldn't, maybe you wouldn't spend that much time doing that. But I just wanted to make sure that everything was kind of tidy, and the names matched the lines, and nothing was kind of merged, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
It would have been a lot easier if I hadn't been doing the thesis. I think I would have just be like, okay, Grant,
I mean, I remember that at the time, and I remember thinking, I remember I got you started with a little bit of code, but I remember going, that's going to be a messy process.
Yeah.
I mean, it'll be worth it when you get out the other end. But I remember thinking at the time, there's going to be a lot of frustration. Like, you're going to have 2 spaces when you should only have 1, and that's going to throw everything else off.
Yeah, right. And it was always like 1 or 2 random ones. So it was like, it looks great. And then you still look and it's like, bastard. So, there's no like
I could picture if you just go back a page, like you don't have the line, you don't have the blank line between Walter and Kat, let's say. So my insurance does not cover PMS, and then but there's no blank line, it goes straight into Kat, and that's just going to throw everything else off.
Yeah, exactly. So you had to also had to use the blanks as well, take them out, put them somewhere else. So it was like but once I got the gist of like, okay, I had to pay attention to these things, which took me a while, but once I got that, I was like, okay, it was time consuming, but I actually was the part that I think I enjoyed the most of the thesis towards the end. I really liked it.
Well, and the flip side is, if you did ever get your hands on another 150 film scripts, it probably wouldn't take you a lot of time to add them all in, because you've you've broken the back on the hard work, if you know what I mean.
And it
would just be a matter of getting the fix.
Well.
Exactly, yeah. So it would actually scale quite well, I think.
Yeah. So there's another format. Sometimes like it was the name in all caps, and then you had to say that it was followed by a colon here. The reason that I added the colon is because then you also had directions like this. There's all capitals. So just to make sure that wasn't thrown in as the name of a character. And then just this, basically just put that, say, okay, from all capitals plus colon, that would be the name. And then anything after that is a line of dialogue. So you kind of split it. So this one wasn't too bad. It was actually quite handy.
What is it? Is that Love Actually?
That's Love Actually, yeah.
Okay. I don't know why. I think it's just because of Heathrow. because I hated it. I hated Love Actually. I mean, I don't dislike rom-coms, but I hated Love Actually.
A lot of people do, and it hasn't aged well either. But
yeah, creepy stalker guy.
Yeah, so many things, but yeah. And then this one was another format. This was also a bit of a pain. So it didn't have any directions, right? And it was the name of the character all in caps, and then anything that followed was line of dialogue. But what I had to be careful here was that, say, look at this line here. Originally, R was in capitals. So this would be picked up as the name of the character. So what I had to do is like, okay, I'll just do kind of like the main work, let's say, like the big stuff. And then I would have a look at which things, like if I saw that the name of the character was R, obviously that wasn't the case. So I went back to the original script and changed it to kind of lower caps, because they didn't there was nothing else to distinguish the two of them. And I couldn't really, maybe there's something someone else can think of another way, but at the time that was kind of what I thought was best. Any questions so far?
I have some.
Yeah.
My video is totally black. Yes, I'm lying on my bed in the dark. I've just managed to put my children to sleep. Hello, everybody. Sorry.
Okay.
I'm fascinated because your parsing problem really resembles what I had in insurance one year, where I received, it was hell compared to your situation. But as a result of that hell, I have thought long and hard about the problem through my many years of dealing with multiple formats of various things. Now, my example is from Excel, but it very much symbolically resembles your situation because you have quite structured text. And in my case, it was bordereau, which is listing of information on an insurance claim line by line. And arguably each line was a different insurance claim, but it might not always be. And each column was a separate piece of information about that claim, but it might not be the same information each time. And through time, they kept changing the formats. So it's like in your case, it'd be they keep writing the script, but in some chapters, they decide to upgrade the format because they missed something. Oh, we want to do lighting now. Well, we forgot in the earlier chapters, we'll just start doing lighting direction. And we'll have this format for lighting direction, which is just a new thing. We'll just keep going like that. And then later on in the script, they add something else like, oh, we need to do character direction, or, oh, there's a pet that doesn't actually have lines, but let's have to tell people what it's doing, and stuff like that, right? It's just weird additions. It's happened to me too. And so I wrote this very long-winded VBA script that would search out the items that we were looking at and try and categorize them based on heuristics, which is, I think, what you've been doing. But let me ask you this question now. So I look at this text here and I think, ooh, it is possible to write a model and I consider it like let's say it's a machine learning model, like an XGBoost type model. I don't know what kind of models you've been exposed to, but an NLP model, let's call it an NLP model. And you kind of say, I want to classify each line. So it's a line by line classifier.
Right.
And it has the information about the previous lines and also potentially their classification. So as it runs through the script, it classifies lines. Let's say it does it sequentially. It doesn't have to, but let's suggest it does. So you run through the script sequentially, both classifying the line above and giving the text of that line, and then asking the model to please now classify this next line, given what I just told you about the lines above. So use some context, some context of the previous line. For instance, if I just told you a character name, it's very likely this is going to be there, whatever they're saying, obviously. Right. And if there was a blank line, well, there is one of, 4 things that can be happening now because it's a blank line. So it can be another character name, or it can be, a chapter heading, or, so a nonlinear model like XGBoost or, something as crazy as a neural net could help, given the text, given its format, given the content, or even just given an n-gram or k, whatever you call, do you call k-grams? What did you like?
Did I use for? We just use regular expressions for this, really.
Really? Wow. Yeah. Okay. So I could break out a row into a k-gram vector, right, and then say, okay, given the k-gram vector and given given the categorization above, please tell me, do you think this is a character? Obviously, if I've already classified this character as like Cal here, if you've seen Cal before, there's your answer. But you know, that classification process with a few, because it'd be tolerant to a few extra spaces and all the other things that you were talking about, like they didn't give a blank line or they didn't always follow the rules. And I'm just totally fascinated with the success approach of that, because you did a lot of annoying, tedious work, as you say, right? And I'm conscious, as Mick says, about scalability. And it's like, you just want this problem to go away. It's the bane of your work, right? This problem just keeps coming up. Is there a better way? We keep trying to make it better. And that's a suggestion I have in terms of a thinking pattern about it. And whether that's something, I don't know. I know you were early to the exercise, and it's
it sounds like really interesting. But yeah, exactly. So I think when we started, it was about 3 years ago, I say, Mick.
Yeah.
I couldn't open our file. So
yeah,
I think this was what I could do. But it sounds, I didn't know that was an option. So so I think sometimes some the things that I didn't know would have helped, but I don't think I was there with my abilities yet.
No,
but it sounds like
really,
it just sounds really, I didn't know that was an option. So that sounds really interesting. If something that I could learn, I would really like that. But
yeah, it might speed up your life. You might be able to do thousands of
I think
scripts.
so, yeah. And it would be a lot
That model
easier.
had success rates.
Yeah.
But anyway, that's a suggestion. That's only the question that I had you considered that kind of idea or a thought as you went along about looking back at how I did it? Can I systematize it now? Because I certainly do about my career. I spent 20 years sorting out other people's data. At the end of that process, you start going, right, next time it happens, can I do it a better way? But anyway, there you go. Thanks.
No, that's really, thank you. No, thank you very much.
Just before that, I did see a couple of people had unmuted, but I'm kind of systematically muting people just in case it's an accident. But does anyone else have any questions before we move on? No. Okay. And like I said, I'm keeping an eye on chat too. So even if you don't, but by all means, just pop them in the chat.
Sorry, I'm aware of the time, so I'll speed up a little bit.
You're okay. You're okay. We don't put a time limit on this for this reason.
Okay, cool. So yeah, this basically like the output of the parser. So something I should mention here as well is that so we had the speaker name from the script, and then for what I did for it to get the speaker gender and the screenwriter gender, I just created a CSV file and I went through the names of the characters in the film, which would be like maybe 20, 30 a film. So it didn't take long. So I had a column with the name of the speaker. So I would match this and I would just decide if it's male or female. Now, I've seen some people that they went to IMDb and kind of, got the gender of the actor and kind of did a correlation whether that name was male or female. But again, I want to make sure that everything was accurate. So for example, doctor, it could have been, that maybe the name of the actor was a bit ambiguous. So I want to really make sure that the gender of the speaker was correct. And then the screenwriter, I just, again, manually just looked it up, but it didn't take long for each film. It was about like 10 minutes. So it wasn't a huge issue. Now, this with the speaker, with the listener name, it was a bit, I had to take some liberties here. So what I did was to fill this column for the listener name. Basically what I did is most of the scenes would be between two people, or the dialogue was, conversation between two people. Obviously, in some cases, it wasn't accurate, but what I did is, for example, if we had the speaker was the doctor, right? And the speaker before that was Alvi, then you'd fill it with the name, the previous name, if that makes sense. And obviously there are cases where there are different scenes and that's not, it's not accurate. Or when I had the full corpus all together, when they changed films, the first line of one of the films would go look at the last line of the previous film. So obviously that wasn't true, that they were talking to the other person. But the vast majority of the cases, it was kind of, talking to this, it was okay. But there, something to be aware of, that is not completely accurate. So yeah, and then again with gender, I just went for male and female. I know there's a lot of talk on gender, but remembering that we're talking about romantic comedies in the 70s to 2018, I can't think of any film where the gender of the character is, neutral or fluid. So I decided to go for the two polars, which if, there's new films with different types of genders, or, where the gender of the character is neutral or whatever it may be, that could be something to do in the future, but it's not something that I considered.
Yeah, and well, also you have the issues. Sorry, someone's just as
Yeah.
we've had a couple of comments how names are also going to be biased.
Yeah.
So the fact that for the purposes of what you were doing, it actually made sense for you to go and add it almost externally, because then you can make the call on what counts for you, and not at all, Ash. It's I'm glad you did. And then another good point is movies like Tootsie and Mrs. Doubtfire.
Right, yeah, where
they're actually gender, but they will very much play up to the gender roles then.
Yeah, exactly. That would be kind of
that's part of the comedy, or at least supposed to be.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, Tootsie wasn't a romantic comedy though, would it be? I doubt Tootsie was in your list.
No, and Miss Doubtfire.
Miss Doubtfire, because I think that might have been.
No.
Romantic. Is it not? No.
Well, I didn't have it.
Oh, right, okay.
I couldn't get the script really.
But I think Mrs. Doubtfire might have counted as romantic. It's a long time since I've seen it.
Yeah.
And I think there is a romantic comedy element
to it. He's trying to get her back, and yeah, true. But yeah, it wasn't part of. But yeah, it's definitely something to kind of think about. But for the films that I had, it wasn't really an issue, so I just moved past that. So yeah, that's basically like the output. So once I had like all my scripts tied up and in this kind of format, that's when I went into the politeness package. So the politeness package that I use is called Politeness, Detecting Politeness. And it was based on the research from these people, Danescu, Niculescu, Nizil, and Voigt et al. So I think he's from Cornell and he's from MIT, I think. So basically, this group of people, they did some research they created a politeness classifier, and they extracted certain features that were, generally present in polite or impolite requests. And something similar was done in this research here, Voigt et al. And then basically what they did, they combined the features that were extracted from two papers, and they create the package in R, because this is Python, I think. And I don't think they have something available for Voigt et al. But anyways, so the important thing that I like, what was useful from this package is that you could count, it was a counting of markers, right? It also claimed that you can get a politeness score, but I was a bit skeptical of that, just because remember talking about the context, and also we tried to kind of run that, and they never really explain how to get the score. And I contacted the developer. He's like, well, maybe you want to stay away from that and focus on the features. So it's like, good, okay. So yeah, basically that's the package that I used. And these are all the features that you can kind of look at, right? It's about 37. Excuse me. The ones that are in gray are the ones that I found, the features that I found differences between male and female speakers. The ones that are in yellow, informal title and WH questions, there are huge differences in formal title between men and women. But once you look at, that was basically about words. So once you look at what words were included in that category, it was all like dude or bro or man or things like that. So obviously men, when they're talking to men, there was a bigger, a higher proportion of use in those cases, and almost not relevant for women. But I'm not saying there's a problem with it. I'm just saying if someone wants to look into informal titles, then should be aware of what words are in that category. And then with yes or no questions, I also found differences.
So sorry, just to be clear there. So you're saying that basically when men spoke to men, they tended to use dude and bro and whatever in the scripts. Is that right?
Exactly.
Whereas women didn't?
Yeah, even when men talking to men, it was like I don't know, much higher proportion than when talking obviously to women,
Right.
or even women when they were talking to men themselves, that way.
Right.
But like, which it makes sense. But if we're thinking of politeness and informal title, kind of going back to informal title, like if you want to show kind of you're part of a group, that would be a potential politeness strategy. But for my case, it's like, okay, I understand that there's a difference, but what does that, doesn't really say much about politeness for my question, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Sorry, I'm actually, I'm just twigging the subtlety you're making there. So to me, like, if you were to ask me kind of coming into this, I would say that dude and bro and statements like that aren't really polite. But by your definition, they totally are, because it's friendliness and
exactly, like buddy or.
Whereas polite to me is more like a formal kind of, upper English class, to use the stereotypes, very kind of a rigid kind of hierarchical kind of formal titles.
Yeah, 100%. But also 100%. But that also, I think, goes back a bit to context, right? So if you're talking to a friend and you call them like a very formal title, that might be interpreted as, that you're angry
or being weird.
Or being weird. So
being off.
That's why, like, there was no difference with informal title, but like,
right.
That's what I mean, I stated there was a difference, but I just, like a bit of a warning sign. And then
sorry, we have a question here. What is 26, the WH questions? Is that like where, why, what?
Exactly. So how, like anything that will be an open-ended question, like the answer is not yes or no.
Okay.
Right. So how, when, why, where, etc. So I found differences between yes or no questions. But what I want to do as well is look at the actual examples to analyze them in a bit of context. And what I found with yes or no questions is that it was very erratic in the way I picked them up. Sometimes they were yes or no, sometimes they were open-ended questions. So there is research that's been done on differences between genders and questions. And again, very sensitive to context, because it could be seen as, someone who's asking a lot of questions as someone who has more power over someone else, or as someone who wants to keep the conversation going. So, but it was hard to kind of make claims about yes or no questions, because it wasn't really yes or no questions. It was, sometimes it would pick up WH questions, sometimes it didn't. It was very erratic, and I couldn't really figure out why sometimes it did and sometimes it didn't. It seemed that sometimes it was even a question mark, it would pick it up as a yes or no question. So if someone wants to look at questions, that would be something to look at as well, like how are they using the questions. But again, and then with subjectivity isn't green, because I included it as hedges. So what I mean by what they mean by subjectivity would be I think, I feel, I believe, I suppose. So that, to me, their function is hedging, right? So it made more sense to have them all together as one category. Yes. So so the ones in gray was the ones that I found differences or significant differences. Again, I is a academia, so you want to find significance or whatever that might mean. So
gotta find those p-values.
I gotta find it exactly. I think that was kind of like the main thing from the package that I wanted to show you as well. I'm not going to go into all of them because it will take ages, but I will show you some plots later on. I think.
And sorry, we've just had a comment here about there's also such a thing as excessive or labored politeness.
Exactly.
And I know there was a comic strip, Gaston and something or other, which was these two excessively polite people who basically couldn't do anything because they were too busy being polite to each other.
Exactly.
So like, let's go for lunch. No, after you. No, after you. And that would become the whole comic strip.
Right. And nothing gets done. Yeah.
Yeah.
There's loads of stuff there. Some of them I found them more useful than others. Again, going back to in terms of politeness. So if you're looking at differences in languages in other terms, you might find, and looking at pronouns more useful, or looking at apologies. Again, this is what I was looking at, gender differences in terms of politeness. So some of them, helped me answer my question a bit more, but there are loads of things that could be done with all these features, if you're interested. Okay. All right, so yeah, basically again, it's a bit small, I'm sorry, but just to show you, basically that was the output, right? So it was, I can't put all the columns because about 50 more columns altogether. But yeah, it was counts really, not so much yes or no, but how the counts of a certain feature being present in a certain line of dialogue. Also something to bear in mind that I should have mentioned, if you're analyzing the features separately, that's, you know, that's grand. But for example, with positive emotion here, it's a massive, it's about 4,000 words, like the bag words that have been classified as positive in terms of emotion. A few things to remember about that if you're thinking of going into that, you know, looking at those type of words, is first of all, like, yes, it's, for example, the word amazing, right? I'm not saying that it doesn't have a positive emotion quality, but there's a difference between expressing emotion and referring to emotion. Again, if you're talking about, you know, large numbers, then, you know, that might even out. But also some of the words, there was an overlap between the categories, which is not, I'm not saying it's a problem with the package. I'm just saying it's something to be aware of if you're aggregating the features, because you might get double counts. So for example, with words from positive emotion, you might also get them in affirmation or agreement or reassurance, right?
Also sarcasm. Sorry,
Yeah.
we're just getting a couple of things in the chat.
Exactly.
And a great example of that actually from earlier was like in The Empire Strikes Back, at some point when Han and Leia are fighting with one another, and Han keeps calling her your worshipfulness. Oh, right. Which would obviously be taken as being polite, but is really mocking.
Exactly. Yeah.
You know, so, and I remember actually I watched a talk, this was in the before times, someone actually did their PhD on trying to detect sarcasm, because it's quite hard to do.
That is hard, yeah.
Yeah, it's very, very difficult to detect kind of irony and sarcasm.
Context,
yeah, I mean, tone is just so important to that. And overall context. Like bag of words would probably do quite poorly on that.
Exactly, yeah.
I would have thought.
Yeah. So there, I think some of them, so especially with pronouns, there's work been done with pronouns and politeness and selfishness. But then when I was looking at it in context, it's like, well, you're really, you know, that kind of way. So if you're looking at it this way, I would just say be careful with what
caveat emptor, as they say in Latin.
Exactly. You know, like you don't make massive claims about what you're seeing, if that makes sense. So yeah, basically this was the output. I just wanted to show kind of what went from there. I think, yeah, so just a few examples from the scripts. So intensifiers, like, you know, great work, really fantastic. And as you were saying with bag words, like they're just looking at the words and not looking at what comes before. There could be some sort of negation before, and that's not really taken into consideration. Reassurance, this was actually one of the categories where I found that by looking at the examples, most of them did yield kind of, it was part of a politeness strategy, which was nice, I don't know, I suppose. Then with hedges,
sorry, just to be clear about what you were doing there. So you essentially you were looking at things that the politeness output was showing you, and then you were going and essentially manually checking it.
Exactly.
Was it to see kind of validity check almost?
Exactly, right. So sometimes it was easier because, say, if you look, so what I would do is like I would go into the corpus and it's like, okay, just looking at reassurance, at least one instance of reassurance, and see what examples came up. And with reassurance, you know, maybe I had 200 lines, so it was easy to read, but with something like positive emotion, I would have 6,000 lines, and it was impossible for me to go through all of them. Yeah. But you do get a sense of, you know, what the story is. Then hedges as well. Hedges was also like a bit of a, not dodgy, but they didn't always. Yes. What I did find though was that, again, this is kind of intuitive as well, when there's like a combination of more than one feature, then that does tend to yield politeness, if that makes sense. So if you look, for example, with please, right? there were differences with please, right? But I think it's not just that the word please is there, is that may I, and then please is there more than once. Because if it said, hello, can I speak with Diane, please? You know, I mean, it'd be like, okay, that's standard, so that's expected. But I think it's sometimes it's what the abundance or the combination of more than one strategy that makes it more interpretable as polite, if that makes sense. Yeah.
Yep.
Cool.
And there's a question they're just saying about some of the categories could overlap. I presume it worked that way. So like if you just go back a couple of to the output, I presume all those counts aren't necessarily adding up to the number of words.
No,
right? They're not necessarily all disjoint, because certain things could hit multiple categories.
exactly.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
Which was also sometimes it was a bit of a problem in some, not a lot of cases, but in some cases that because when I did I'm not going to go into this too much, but when I did the models to see what the interactions were, and I was working with proportions, right? So the word count plus the, I don't know, positive emotion. And in some cases, the word count for was lower than the number of, what you call it, the features, right? Which was odd. Sometimes one word was counted twice. So I think there's just some small issues like with the package itself, perhaps that's one word was counted twice within the same category. It was very isolated cases, but I think you would only realize that if you're really going into the data, you know, and kind of really looking at it. So yeah, does that answer the question?
Yep.
Cool. Yeah, and then we have swearing. Sorry, apologies. Hope I'm not offending. And I think I went for the milder one because Mick saw the other one. It was a bit more offensive, I suppose. But yeah, again, it's just the accumulation, like the repetition of swearing, right? Because there are other cases that you might see a swear word, but it was between friends. And I was like, I wouldn't necessarily say that that's impolite because they're between friends. But for example, when you have like first person and then swear, like you're obviously directing an insult towards someone, and that was nearly always would have been interpreted as impolite, if that makes sense.
Right.
Yeah. So yeah, but again, it didn't mean that like a lot of times, obviously, when they were swearing, it had the potential to be interpreted as impolite or rude. But in some cases, it's just, you know, some conversation between friends, and I don't think the friend would have been offended by it. So yeah, and then so some of the use, I think we're there. Yeah. So some of the uses that we were thinking of was kind of network analysis. So this was something I wish I would have done a bit more of. But again, I had supervisors and I had time limits and I had deadlines. So so we're looking at kind of like, for example, for Notting Hill, this is just with the number of words, just to get a notion of centrality for the characters. And I think it would be really interesting to kind of see what type of words they're using when, I don't know, are they using more politeness? Well, words typically related to polite or typically related to impolite when they're talking to the other central characters, or what happens to the secondary characters as opposed to the main characters. And again, I didn't really get to do much on this, but I really wish I would have had a chance.
Yeah, I think there'd be something very like when you kind of compare how the importance of the characters with how they interact with their politeness scores.
Exactly.
And the gender differences between them, I think would be quite interesting, because I could see, I mean, again, it's very easy to put a story on these, but you could definitely see where the central characters are more polite when talking to another, but less polite when talking to less central.
Yeah, exactly.
And you know, gender differences between that.
Yeah, absolutely. So say here, when Harry met Sally, I thought this would be a good one to have a look to see what the way that Harry talks. Obviously, like you have these four characters, you know, they're all Sally and Harry and Sally, and then these two are friends, you know, that kind of way. So I think it'd be interesting to see the way that Sally talks to Marie and the way she talks to Harry, or Harry talks to Jess, who's the man, by the way, and Sally. So I think that would be quite interesting. Now, Harry's character is quite rude as it is, so it might not work out that way, but yeah. And then this is another one for One Fine Day. Again, this is quite, as you can see, there are depending on the film, there's different ways that the characters are become a bit more or less central. And yeah, to kind of sum up what I found, again, this is just some of the findings. So for example, with her swearing, I think was one of the most interesting kind of differences. I found that there was difference between the screenwriter groups. Okay, so for obviously it was for the male speakers, like here, talking to other male speakers, that was the highest proportion, or estimated proportion, I should say, of swearing. And there's a huge difference when they were talking to women as well. And that happened for all the screenwriting groups, but with male screenwriters, you know, having a higher proportion overall. But for female characters, when they were, it was kind of the opposite, right? When they were talking to other female characters, they're slightly more likely to use swearing, but the differences are not as clear as for male speakers, if that makes sense. Do you see what I mean? Because like, if you look at this one, it's practically the same. There's not a huge difference. But if you look at male characters written by female screenwriters, there is a kind of noticeable difference. That was something too that I thought was interesting. Then with reassurance, I don't know if reassurance was something like, oh, it's okay, don't worry, it's fine. Again, it's kind of like the opposite trend in a way. So when the speaker is talking to someone of the opposite gender, they tend to use more of these features than when they're talking to their own gender. Intensifiers, same thing, right? And with hedges, it's just, there was no interaction with the speakers or the screenwriter, but women tend to use it slightly more frequently. But something that I thought was interesting, especially with the interactions between listener and speaker, is that those features that are more closely related to politeness, both male and female tend to use it more when they're addressing kind of members of the opposite gender. So they modify it in a way. It can, again, I don't want to make, you know, blanket statements, but it seems that they modify their language when they're talking to someone of the opposite gender. And again, this might have to do with romantic comedies, because the idea is that, you know, they're trying to sort of romantic interest, so you want to advance a relationship by being polite, and you know, and the opposite would happen when you're swearing, right? If your love interest, you try to be polite and swear less, if that makes sense. But again, I'm not saying this is exactly the case. I'm just saying that's a possible theory for those differences, if that makes sense. So yes, intense. I don't know if you want me to show any of the plots more in detail. You're just gonna
just go back the huge difference. If you just go back one, Lucia,
yeah.
The intensifiers. I mean, there's a huge. I mean, in the other ones, you would say like there was a couple of them where the two bars are basically overlapping. I know there's a slight difference in the mean, but that's why I love quantifying uncertainty so much, because you know, those point differences might seem a lot until you look at the uncertainty bars. But I mean, I mean, so basically, if I'm reading this right, it's basically with a male speaker speaking to a male, they use intensifiers a lot less than when they're speaking to a female.
Yes.
And vice versa.
Yeah.
So essentially, cross-gender conversation has a significant effect on the use of intensifiers. That is interesting. Yeah. Now, I know obviously it's a small sample, but
yeah, exactly. But also, and again, so sometimes I was looking at the proportions, like, oh, just, you know, 120, whatever. It's not a huge thing. But then if you're thinking of one word category compared to all the other words, it's unlikely that half of the words that we use are going to be one category. Do you know that way?
Yeah.
So I think that's why the proportions are so low. So it is hard to kind of draw huge conclusions, but yeah, I thought some of them were really interesting. That they had changed their, because I think there are some aspects of language that we kind of, going back to the two differences between politeness, like I say, a theoretical concept, or more what we understand as politeness. Swearing and intensive, like, oh, that's amazing, that's lovely, that's fantastic. I think those are things that we kind of, or in general, we acknowledge as being polite, whereas other things might be a bit, you know, less obvious. So I think that might have been why, you know, like more salient aspects of politeness. I think those were the main differences were found, if that makes sense. So yeah, that would be the hedges there, and that's about it. So do you have any questions?
Yeah, we'll throw it out. We did have one question, although there's been a bit of a conversation in the chat, is that Ash has been asked first of all, wants to say that Notting Hill is a great film, which it is. I totally agree. Yeah, Notting Hill would actually be one of my
I don't know why I said thank you. I didn't write it.
Yeah.
Sorry, can I stop sharing, or do you need me to?
It's you know what, you may as well, just in case you want to refer to something.
Okay, yeah, perfect.
Asking what the practical applications are. Can you think of any, just in general, like what may be the practical applications of like what you did? Is there any practical uses that you can think of it?
In the sense of like outside of kind of academia, or like
or just in general, is there anything you think this stuff will be useful for? I mean, I have a few thoughts myself, but I'd be curious to know what you think.
Yeah, no. So I think sometimes in terms of politeness, that not that I don't think it's a bad thing that, you know, there's like this stereotype of women being more polite than men or whatever it might be. I think sometimes it kind of, to be aware of the language that we're using, and perhaps be less apologetic in some cases, or just trying to think of what you mean by practical applications. Like,
I'll leave it up to Ash. But I think like one of the things that has been answered is that like emotion analytics is used a lot.
Yeah.
So like figuring out based on Slack, MS Teams conversations and call logs, who's getting on with who and who isn't. And I know that I could definitely see that being very useful. I mean, again, it can be a bit tricky because a lot of it could be very context specific.
Yeah.
A great example of it is outstanding.
Right.
So the word outstanding often means very positive, but it can also mean that you have a lot of issues, or this issue is still outstanding.
I get you.
And that can be, and I know some colleagues of mine did some very similar work to this actually on email NLP stuff, and they did not quite using politeness, but it was mainly done in Python, so they may have used some of the stuff that you were referring to.
Okay. Yeah.
But what they did notice was that especially because it was a life insurance company which handles a lot of pension stuff, and obviously tax deadlines become quite important. But what they did really notice is that the longer the interaction went on between a customer and a client, the tone and negativeness increased massively towards the end. So like, because the issues weren't getting resolved and the pressure was on because it had to be in by whatever the deadline was.
Right.
Otherwise you lose your tax break. People get a lot, well, not even direct, like in some cases the customers will actually become abusive, like flat out, like horrendous language.
Right. Yeah.
You know, but it was interesting to see it was interesting to kind of see. But I think in general, just the fact that you could, like I said, I mean, you were being very, very humble there at the start, when you said that, you know, I helped. I mean, I got you started because, you know, I helped. But but what I'm saying is most of my help was in just going you from 0 to 1 in terms of like, you didn't really know what R Studio was and you'd never used R before. So like kind of once I showed you the first bit, you kind of did most of that yourself. So I think it's very interesting to see with the power of a lot of these tools, how quickly you can actually do some quite interesting stuff relatively quickly.
And going back to the question, I was just thinking there, something that I want originally when I first started this, I want to see if you could build a classifier based on politeness strategies. I don't know how realistic that would be. I think you need a lot more, or perhaps more sophisticated tools. But I think that would be interesting to see, like, what, for example, online interactions, like, you know, if it's male or female, kind of forensic linguistics in a way, I suppose. Is the writer male or female? I think that would be interesting. But I don't know, from my results, it's like, is that possible? Anyways, for now, but maybe there's someone that knows a bit more about more sophisticated ways of doing that. But yeah, that's something that when I first started, I was full of notions, thinking that I could build a classifier. And I was like, I'm going to do groundbreaking stuff.
Well, I mean, the issue was there's a bit of chat going on that you're probably not catching, but they're like there's the Twitter chat bot that learned rude words after time and posting to social media before taking down. So it could be useful to like do that, because it went, it went super racist and bigoted really quickly.
I heard that. I heard that.
And they had to take it down. But then they've even found other problems with a lot of other like NLP stuff, because of the training corpus it's trained on. In a lot of cases, it's an incredibly biased data set.
Yeah.
So like the classic example was you couldn't really refer to anything Muslim related immediately went to like jihadi violence.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Like
All right.
really bad.
Well, all right.
Because
We'll have to
obviously
monitor that.
it's and that's but again it's so difficult. Like, and as someone said, because people are arseholes, right? And what they'll do is they'll hack it as well. So like you've got this thing called, sorry, someone else referred to it, poisoning it with passive aggressiveness and toxic positivity.
Right. Yeah.
So and you can get
That's a
all
good
that
point.
kind of stuff too. So
yeah. So yeah, I think I enjoy doing it, but then the more I kind of looked at it, it's like either you need a lot more people to look up more data to be able to really understand how to create a better model, if you want to say. But it was something that you can't just
Oh, well, you could also use the tools that Sai was referring to earlier. Like there is an awful lot of very super powered kind of NLP model, but again, they have those problems that we were talking about before that, and it really does depend. Oh, one thing, I mean, sorry, there's a question here about were films from the 40s compared to modern ones. But obviously you started in the 70s, but did you notice much of a time change between, say, the early rom-coms and the later ones?
See, I tried to kind of look at like from me just looking at it, or just any like actual numbers. Do you mean?
Right.
I'm asking
just in general, was there?
Well, it depends. Not so much. Like what I noticed with, let's say, for example, with Woody Allen films that I had not a lot, but like I think three Woody Allen films, and like his characters, it was a lot of, for example, the male characters, a lot of hedging, but that's kind of his characters are kind of a bit pardoned and neurotic, Yeah. So I did see that, because when I was looking at the examples with hedges and stuff like that, it's like he kept coming up, his characters kept coming up. Then swearing again with Woody Allen, he came up a good bit, and then kind of later on with kind of more, what's his name? Knocked Up. What's his name? I forgot.
Seth Rogen. Oh, Judd.
Judd Apatow.
Judd Apatow. Yeah.
With him, it came up a lot, but not huge difference that I could be like, okay, I can 100% say this or that. Like it was just specific features more than overall things, if that makes sense.
Okay.
Yeah. But again, this was me. I couldn't really go through all of the features. I was just looking at the features that I found differences in, if that makes sense.
And sorry, there was a question there from Sai just about a biased data set. So sorry, I think you joined a bit late. So Lucia referred to that. Basically, she took whatever free script she could find online and then just went with that. So there was very much a caveat that it wasn't necessarily fully representative of the full genre. Yeah. It was just basically whatever she could analyze.
Okay, so can I follow up then and say it's very interesting to understand bias. And did we look at bootstrapping? You have sort of significance ranges on your outcomes, but I am very interested in the distributional form of the spread. Meaning, did we think about bootstrapping or some other non-parametric measure for looking at how much your outcomes vary depending on which subset of scripts you picked?
I'm going to show my ignorance here. What's bootstrapping?
The short answer to that, Sai, is no.
I'm sorry. I remember you mentioned it once, Mick, and I was like, what? And it was towards the end of the PhD. It's like, I just want this to be over. To be honest, because I remember Mick brought it up. I was like, I can't learn more things right now. My brain is done. But I remember he did mention it. So I'm sorry.
Yeah. I'm a big fan of the bootstrap.
So I think you wanted to do something with that. And I was like,
well, I think that's definitely something you would do, But I mean, I should point out that when Lucia first came to me about the PhD, I strongly advised her not to do it. And then, although I was wrong, because that would have meant that, you wouldn't have got this, which I think has been, very interesting. But I mean, you get to a point very, very quickly in your PhD when you just want it to end.
Yeah.
And that would be 6 months into a 3-year project, typically.
Yeah. I was kind of like, just make it stop. That's what I mean. So I'm sorry.
And the fact that most of people's time is taken up with the data question, which is like why I was so passionate about that point about classifying each of the lines in your scripts would have been the hardest part. And that would happen very early on in your time doing the PhD, because you're like handed a bunch of scripts and told to go. And you're like, I'll just do my best. Yeah, with no real understanding of what kind of question to even ask whether it could be done a better way. Like you wouldn't even know who to ask about whether this could be done a good or bad way. And that is the hard part of the situation. And I am, yes, I have the same experience. Like there was nobody around me to ask. And so 20 years later, I've got an answer. And that's the problem. Like, well, that's no good, is it, for a PhD? What do you do? And so I don't know. What do you do, Mick? Do you just have chat groups like this that kind of...
Yeah, I mean, basically, I mean, to a certain extent, peer review. But I mean, by peer review, I don't necessarily mean publication peer review. I mean this kind of thing, where just people look at stuff and come up with ideas, and it's not necessarily designed around getting tenure or whatever.
Because generally it was sorry, Mick.
No, go on.
No, that it was an issue, not an issue, but like at one point I was like, I don't know how to do this. And I genuinely had, like, I went to my supervisor and he was kind of like, I don't know.
Make something, do sometimes
something.
you just got to make something up. Yeah.
And then he was kind of like, I don't know, have a look. And then it was desperation. Sorry, and I'm not saying that you were my last resort, Mick, but it's like, I think that's kind of was like, who can I ask? And I thought of Mick. Well, I thought of Fran first. Sorry. And she led me to Mick. But
you're very lucky.
I got very lucky, I know. But it was kind of like I was stuck. I was like, and I have to do something. Otherwise, I would have lost, I don't know, 2 years of, doing nothing, and I had to start all over again. So thankfully, Mick came to my rescue.
And how long? Pardon my inability to have joined on time. I'm sorry. How far through are you now?
Oh, I'm done. I'm finished.
So you got through your peer review?
Well, I have my Viva on in January.
And did you publish?
No, I didn't.
Oh, why not?
I don't know. Like I don't know.
Well, no, I didn't either, because you probably realized you didn't want a career in academia, so you didn't need to publish.
Yeah, my supervisor did encourage me to publish. And this was towards, I say, June. He was kind of like, oh, you want to think about publishing? And to be honest, I was looking at the deadlines and I was writing and I was like, I can't. So now what he said is, before the defense, he was like, well, the Viva, he was like, you might want to look into publishing. But it's something that honestly I wouldn't know where to start. And it's not like I think he assumes that, I'll find stuff. So it can be a bit lonely with PhD sometimes. But yeah, I think I didn't have that support, like or that encouragement for a supervisor.
So you could go on and do another PhD.
Oh, buzzing, can't wait.
Yeah.
But I haven't, but it was something that was discussed. But to be honest, I wouldn't even know where to start with that process. So if anyone has any advice,
topic that a lot of people would love to hear about, it'd be very, what would you say, social media, Me Too, kind of. They take your outcomes and use them there, so you get a lot of visibility. And that
would be great. No, honestly, if anyone has any advice on where to start, do you send it my way?
Well, put once you've got all your work done, put all your stuff up on GitHub, I'd say.
And
that's your starting point. Seriously, put all that code up on GitHub. Just put it up there. At least you have it then.
Yeah.
No. And that way people can play with it as well. I do see a couple of other people unmuting and stuff and hands up and stuff. Does anyone else, Ash, Matthew, or Stephen, do any of you have a question?
Hi everyone. Please, this is Ash. First of all, thanks a lot to Lucia, Mike, Siren. Brilliant presentation. And just have to give the background that I do attend a lot of meetup groups, and today I was browsing through my meetup groups and found this group very fascinating. It was related to somewhat of data science and sorry to apologize, I say and the movie script and things like that. So I thought of trying to listen and learn something more, and that I learned a lot today.
Oh, that's good to hear.
Yep.
And a couple of questions I've asked because I've worked on data science before. And obviously I believe that summary, if I may say, my understanding is that is mostly about converting text to speech. And that was obviously going on for some time, and to apply that to romantic comedy movies, found myself very fascinating. And many thanks.
Oh, okay.
Oh,
Well, thank you.
thank you.
I'm glad. Please come
did I
again.
miss a question there? No. Did I miss a question? No, I didn't think I did. Did I?
Yeah, sorry. I mean, the question was like, what kind of language? I mean, I'm also relearning some of the data science. I'm not a computer programmer.
What did I use to kind of process that?
Yeah, I can't even write a line of code. Having said that, I've learned in the past. I've learned C++, IBM, whatever. What's that called? Mainframe, COBOL.
Oh, if you've done all that, to be honest, you'll find Python or R very, very
Python
easy.
is fine. Python, yeah.
If you do, I mean,
Python,
so all of this was done in R, but like Python
R
has
is scientific.
NLTK and has quite a lot of natural, and there's Spacey as well, which actually some of this used Spacey, which is a kind of a Python package, but it was used within R through Reticulate, and that enhanced the output of the Politeness package as well.
Brilliant.
But yeah, I mean, if you know Python, then all this stuff, there's a whole load of tools available for you.
Yeah, Python. I've just got the Anaconda and the Python and the Jupyter and the Spider, whatever. But I'm personally, I was in my early career, I was a sailor. I used to sail on a ship.
Oh, right.
For
Okay.
5-6 years. So I'm a more of a maritime turned into whatever. Anyway, thanks. Really appreciate. Really appreciate.
No problem. So do you mind if I stop sharing? Because it's
no,
we're not seeing anyone.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we're kind of coming to the time. Does anyone else have any questions before we? Sorry, did you have a question?
Yeah, sure. Thanks. Hey, thanks for joining us. Yeah, and welcome to the end of the PhD channel.
Thank you.
So I really liked it, and if you look at the comments I was posting in the chat, outside romantic comedies are really stylized because people state their true emotional state after 15 seconds. But outside of that, like look at the my favorite speech from Born Identity when Conklin blows a fuse and Abbott is getting ultra sarcastic.
I think I missed.
It's in the chat. If you look in the text chat, yeah.
And if you pass that, I was trying to download Intention and run it, but if you pass that through the filter, it probably won't show up at all. And like it's going to be hard to map that to like I'm very concerned about the status of this investigation, but that's what it's saying. If you're worried about a budget meeting, if we don't take care of this, we don't make it to the men's room, is that clear enough for you? We will burn for this, we will both of us burn. How's that going to go in emotional analytics? I mean, I'm just saying that.
To be honest, I mean, it's hard to say. I mean, just to say, which like when Lucia first told me about this,
right.
I actually had no idea what would come of it, but I thought it would be interesting to try. So it would be curious to see how genres affect the outputs of this, because like you said, no, what you might need is for something like romantic comedy, like you said, Lucy, it is a very kind of structured, and also because you're interested in gender, it's gonna show the highlights of the biases that Hollywood have. It'd be very curious to see. You'd probably need more of the tools that Sai was talking about, where you'd basically just need to bring a bigger gun to solve those problems. Because
I'm also interested that as you talk, Mick, I'm like, okay, I'm sitting in a romantic comedy, I'm looking up at the screen, I see expression, I see emotion, and there's no words yet. Okay, then there's words, but that's words that we see on the page here. So your subset of information is incredibly small compared to the set of that you might have wanted to see. And if you expanded your thinking, not that I want to push you back into your PhD for more trauma, but I was like, hey, you could get the video out of that, and there'd be the interpretation, and then your sentiment scores and your sarcasm measure and a whole bunch of gender related politics stuff would be very much stronger signals. Obviously it's now the interpretation of the actors or the director, but still, that's, I think, what you were interested in. You know, you're interested in what are the gender stereotype roles that are being portrayed in media or in, I don't know, film, and you kind of want to be able to bring that out. You know, it's a worthy task, and films are out there, so you could just pass these filters over the top of the video to be able to get sentiment along with the text, because having the text alongside makes it very clear that you'll know what they were saying. Very good feature sets. But if you have a picture of their face as they're talking, well, that's quite helpful, because that tells you emotional status, probably could push your sarcasm score much more clearly, and disambiguate a whole bunch of fun stuff. And, you know, also, what can you say? Like, you know, you've done your PhD, it's all over now. You don't have to work. But you kind of go, look at the joy you could have had with like going into the video parsing and modern algorithms. Like, you could have pulled GPT-2 out, and like it would have been able to do the contextual scoring of you would just, this bag of words methods being used. How poor are they? They could have been like so outclassed by just pulling out something like, I don't know, what is it? Core NLP, stuff like that. So fascinating.
Sorry, someone said something there.
Is that you, Steve? Sorry.
Sure. Yeah, I was kind of sort of framing things to this earlier. I was saying, I mean, if you train on romantic comedies as opposed to, I mean, I pasted a link to, you know, Emotion AI conference, you know, so where the commercial action is at is, you know, sort of work-related references, not, you know, the true intent of keeping romantic comedies. I don't know how relevant that is, but that's, you know.
Sorry, I couldn't quite hear what you were saying there, Stephen. It was very muffled.
Where the commercial action is at is in work-related utterances. It's, you know, it's not in parsing film scripts. I don't know how relevant that is, but
yeah, it's in parsing. What? Sorry.
Parsing work-related utterances. Stuff.
Okay.
Stuff people say on Slack and in meetings, but yeah, you know, even the people have published on, you know, gender differences. So like when women present at meetings, they make sort of undercutting and self-deprecating remarks. So instead of saying, if you would please turn to Appendix A, just turn to Appendix A.
Yeah.
Like, you mean like looking at using similar strategies to look at different kind of like work, what Mick was saying with Slack chats. Was that it, Mick?
It was actually Stephen made that reference, but the work that was actually done by my colleagues, this was 7 or 8 years ago, was on emails. It was all based, they basically pulled stuff off the Exchange server.
Right.
So they had all the internal, and they could put like the internal org chart on top of it, but then deal with all the external emails that were essentially customers, and then just getting a whole load of sentiment analysis and topic modeling and stuff. It was amazing, like relatively straightforward stuff today. It was a bit more cutting edge back then, but it's all very, very doable with basically library calls. Like, it's not, most of the work is actually in the data parsing.
It's not just email though. And if you can see the call data, who calls who when. So if you can see if A, B, and C are working on a team and they have a discussion, A and B have a private discussion. Meanwhile, C checks in some code and B calls A. You can infer that something happened. It's not just email. We've gotten way beyond email. So when you put all, and you can see the inferred report chart and who actually talks to who, all that stuff. So you know, I don't know.
No, and I think especially when you have with text as well, like there's not all those other aspects that I kind of didn't look at with romantic comedies. So it's all in text, and there's the only way to convey politeness or impoliteness is just in what you write. So it might be a bit more informative than using films, if that makes sense.
Sure. Yeah, but I mean, I'm saying you can also infer from the absence of writing that A, B, and C are trying to make a decision. A talks to B privately, meanwhile C goes off to reservation.
I see what you mean.
So when the dirty stuff goes down, people are smart enough to not put it on Slack, so there's no audit trail. And very strange things that you can look at GitHub commits. I've seen people write entire 4-lettered manifestos in GitHub commits and stuff.
Yeah. I actually heard. I mean, I will talk about it some other time, but I did hear a fascinating project where someone basically assessed the quality of their code base using their source control and their chats and a whole load of, and also their issue trackers, because they could figure out where the commits were coming from that they were then propagating downstream to cause a lot of issues with customer service later on. And they basically figured out who their best coders were, because it wasn't on a dollar adjusted basis. It was just fat. But like you said, because you were using the multiple signals from multiple directions, you could get a much richer sense of what the world was.
Right. Sure. I mean, I'm saying like inferring from the absence of something, you know, if you're having a phone call and somebody suddenly hangs up and goes off to do something else, you can infer something from that. It's not, you know, even if they don't write F a lot of U's, I'm going to code this the way
It's hard to spot when something is not there, though, isn't it?
Well, I'm saying you can combine the multimodal stuff, so it equals from using.
Well, can I just ask on that point, like before we all went into lockdown and people had relationships in the office where they wouldn't have been, you know, they would have been having side conversations in person or whatever. How does that fit into that analysis of the, for the employee analysis via Slack or email?
I'm not sure I follow what you mean there, Fran. What do you mean in terms of, because all the relationships are online now as opposed to face-to-face?
Yeah, exactly. Because there would have been pre-pandemic face-to-face office aspect of that. So how does that figure in, or does it not need to?
I don't know. You'd have to look at it, I suppose. But, I mean, it's very hard. It's very, very easy to come up with like an a priori narrative for this kind of stuff, where you could say, oh, well, it makes sense that this will be the case, but realistically, you'd probably just have to, like I said, when Lucia first came to me with the project, I had no idea what she was going to find, but I thought it was going to be interesting to try. So I think in a lot of cases, you just have to give these a go, you know. But anyway, on that note, I think we should call it there, because I've just noticed the time and it's 8:45. So thank you very much. And what I'm going to do is stop recording. And thank you very much, everyone, for coming. That was very enlightening. I had a funny feeling the comments and questions on this will be great. So I'd like to thank everyone who contributed, because you know, it was particular. I mean, like I said, I had a certain view of what Lucía was doing, but I was particularly looking forward to hearing what people were like, how they were going to react. We will be back in December with the final workshop of my Dublin Data Science Soup to Nuts project. And I do have a couple of speakers lining up. It looks like we're going to be virtual for another while, unfortunately, with COVID numbers being the way they are. Exactly. But yeah, I hope to see you all. And thank you very much, Lucía. I really enjoyed that. And thank you very much for volunteering your time.
No, thank you for having
We all
me.
really appreciate it. I'm going to end the recording
I'll try
now.
to publish. Thank you.
Yeah, I was gonna, encourage Lucía. Like, honestly, this is good stuff. Please do publish.
Oh, that's good to hear.
I was trying to dig up the transcript of the Motion AI 20.